An old man bought an abandoned cabin to die in peace, but he found a woman and her baby. The vast, unforgiving expanse of the Arizona-New Mexico border had claimed the last shreds of Whispering Wind's soul. 2 harsh winters had stolen his wife and his son, leaving him a ghost caught between 2 irreconcilable worlds. He had paid a meager sum for a skeletal adobe shack in the Painted Canyon, seeking only a quiet corner to surrender to the dust. His existence was a grueling, solitary penance, exhausting his body until his mind was too weary to conjure the phantoms of his grief. One sweltering afternoon, while tearing up the rotten floorboards of his desolate cabin, the labor stopped. Beneath the last of the decayed wood, his fingers brushed against something cold and unyielding. The sound of splintering wood was replaced by the ominous clink of metal against metal. He unearthed a small, heavy chest, a cache overflowing with ancient Spanish silver coins and sacred indigenous turquoise jewelry. These were a trove of stolen history, pieces belonging to the local tribes, likely looted during the bloody frontier wars, hidden by a thief who never returned. Whispering Wind sensed the malignant gravity of the find, a treasure steeped in ancestral blood and tragedy. He did not immediately return the objects to the earth. A dark curiosity, a dangerous feeling of fate, tethered him to the cache. He hid it away in the deepest shadow of the cabin, the heavy weight of the silver a physical burden against his chest. He knew instinctively that this cursed wealth would inevitably draw the violence and greed of the outside world directly to his doorstep, ending the silence he had desperately sought. It was a secret, a loaded pistol now resting beneath his floorboards. The vast canyon, once his sanctuary of silence, was now a trap. That fateful night, the stillness was shattered. It wasn't the howl of a coyote, but a sound far more fragile and potent. The desperate, quiet pleas of a woman. A sound that reached out of the darkness and gripped his long-dead heart. He moved to the small, grimy window, the rifle already cold in his hands. Clinging to the shadows outside his dilapidated wall were a young woman named Sarah Vance and her small, ailing son, Thomas, barely 5 years old. Fleeing a life of brutal servitude under a powerful, merciless saloon owner and land speculator, Donald Harrison, Sarah's terror was palpable. Mistaking the Apache for a killer, she whispered a broken plea in the dark, a desperate sound of absolute fear. Whispering Wind's quiet penance was over. Outside, his silent, solitary existence had been irrevocably altered by the sight of a woman and her baby, desperate and alone. The metallic scent of the stolen silver and the raw fear of the woman converged in the night air. He saw in her eyes, and in the fevered stillness of the child, the same crushing loneliness that had driven him to this ruin. This chest of blood-stained silver had brought the violence to him. Now that same violence had delivered a desperate, human counterweight. A change, drastic and inevitable, had been announced by the whisper of a frightened woman. His weary spirit, which longed for nothing more than the final cold embrace of the earth, was suddenly compelled to choose a different path: protection. Whispering Wind offered water and shelter, 2 gifts as precious as life itself in the desert. Sarah Vance, part Irish, part Yaqui, watched him with the wide, haunted eyes of a deer caught in a snare. Her terror was palpable, but beneath it lay a profound exhaustion, the kind that only running for survival can carve into a person's spirit. The small boy, Thomas, coughed raggedly, clutching at his mother's skirt, the fever burning too bright beneath his pale skin. The warrior moved with a silent, deliberate grace, lighting a small fire that cast trembling shadows on the adobe walls. It was in that flickering light, surrounded by the rough comfort of a stranger's ruin, that a fragile immediate truce was forged, born not of trust, but of mutual depletion and a shared, profound loneliness. They were 2 souls utterly rejected by the harsh realities of the frontier. The Apache had lost his family. The woman feared losing hers. This unspoken kinship ignited a flicker of something long dormant in his devastated heart. He did not ask her to leave. He simply spread out a worn blanket and offered what little dry jerky he possessed. Sarah watched him, her hand gripping the cold barrel of a pistol she'd kept hidden. As the night deepened and the coyote calls echoed across the canyons, she finally spoke, her voice a low, broken confession. She had fled not only to save her son from a life of brutal servitude, but because she knew the terrible truth behind this abandoned shack. Donald Harrison, the merciless saloon owner and land speculator from Dust Creek Settlement, the man who had held her captive, had hidden a vast treasure here years ago. It was the cache of silver and turquoise, the very wealth Whispering Wind had just discovered. Sarah had hoped to retrieve it, use its value to purchase their freedom, and finally escape the crushing weight of Harrison's ownership. Instead, she had been chased into the arms of the man Harrison feared most, the Apache warrior. Whispering Wind listened, the sound of the wind outside like the heavy breath of a sleeping beast. The cruel irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. The violence he sought to avoid had chased them both here, delivering the woman and her son as human sacrifices to his secret. He confirmed her worst fears with a single slow nod. Harrison would come for them, driven by an avarice that respected neither boundaries nor blood. The desert silence had become a waiting game, and their lives were the inevitable collateral. The weight of the silver in the hidden chest felt suddenly unbearable, a moral burden he could not carry. He took a heavy pickaxe and walked out under the moonlight, choosing a spot near the crumbling foundation of an old, dried-up well. He dug with a fury that surprised even his own weary body, tearing up the earth until he reached the cool, damp ground deep below the surface. He retrieved the chest, the gleam of the coins a treacherous mockery in the darkness, and lowered it into the pit. He buried the treasure, not just with dirt and rock, but with a piece of his bitter, solitary past, effectively giving the cursed wealth back to the desert. When he returned, Sarah was asleep, the child resting precariously on her shoulder. He stood over them, the rifle now resting against the wall, his spirit making a solemn, life-altering pact. The exhaustion of his grief suddenly seemed less important than the pressing need to protect this fragile, temporary family. The memory of his own lost son rose up, sharp and clear. A silent vow was formed, stronger than any blood oath. He would not let them suffer the same fate. He woke Sarah before dawn, the air already thick with the promise of relentless heat. His decision was made, and there was no turning back. He looked at her not as a stranger, but as a fellow fugitive on a road with no destination but survival. He explained to her that the desert would soon betray their location. The cabin was no longer safe. She saw the new resolve in his eyes, the same look of determined defiance that had always defined the true warriors of his tribe. As the sun began to paint the canyon walls in fiery streaks, casting their shadows long and thin across the sand, Whispering Wind led Sarah and Thomas out into the wilderness. He carried the boy, whose small weight felt both heartbreakingly fragile and profoundly heavy with responsibility. He stopped just beyond the horizon, turning back for one last look at the desolate shack that had been his intended tomb. He had stepped across the threshold, choosing the difficult, dangerous path of life over the easy, quiet surrender of death. The last vision of his old, solitary world was that small, crumbling adobe wall. He took his first steps into the unforgiving, dangerous territory, irrevocably committed to his mission. The journey had begun, driven by the simple, powerful act of a promise. He had lost his family, and he would not let her lose hers. The desert floor was the canvas of their new existence, painted in hues of relentless ochre and indigo shadow. Their journey was not toward a place, but away from a man, Donald Harrison, whose shadow stretched longer and darker than any midday sun. Whispering Wind led them into the maze of the painted canyon, a landscape of jagged rock formations and sudden, perilous drops. He moved like a creature born of the earth, reading the subtle signs of the terrain, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, the distant circling of a buzzard. All were chapters in a book only he could understand. Sarah, holding her ailing son tight against the jolting pace, struggled to keep up. The heat was a tangible weight, pressing down on their shoulders, and every gulp of stale air was a small, burning sacrifice. Their destination was the Dragoon Hills, a network of hidden valleys and high passes known only to the Apache. It was a place of ancestral protection, yet for Whispering Wind, it was also a place of exile, filled with the ghosts of the family he had lost and the tribe who had rejected him. The tension between his need for refuge and his ingrained fear of rejection was palpable in his rigid shoulders. Days bled into one another, marked only by the dwindling water supply and the slow, arduous climb. Then they arrived at a water source, a hidden spring sheltered beneath an overhang of rose-colored granite. As Sarah knelt to drink, the desperate relief washing over her, she heard a sound that was not the trickle of water. It was the scraping of metal, quickly muffled. A figure emerged from the shadows of the cave, a tall, stern-faced Apache woman, her gaze sharp as flint. Her name was Soaring Eagle, the current matriarch and leader of a small, isolated clan. Her initial expression, focused on Whispering Wind, was a charged blend of recognition and undisguised disapproval. He was the scout, the traitor who had walked with the enemy. The air crackled with their unspoken history. The attention of Soaring Eagle then shifted to Sarah and the child. Her scrutiny was clinical, assessing the woman's mixed blood heritage. Part Yaqui, evident in the determined line of her jaw, and part something foreign, written in the paleness of the boy's skin. The interaction was immediately charged with tension and mutual curiosity. Whispering Wind presented them not as guests, but as a commitment. He spoke in low, clipped tones, the Apache words hard and definitive, explaining the peril and the shared blood of the child's Yaqui lineage, making no apology for his choice. The revelation came with the woman's unspoken scrutiny. Soaring Eagle noticed the necklace Sarah wore, a simple braided leather cord holding a shard of polished obsidian. It was a stone found only in the deepest passes of the Dragoon Hills, often given to children as a blessing of endurance. Soaring Eagle remembered that piece. It was one of a handful, crafted by her own father decades ago, given to a young Yaqui woman who had fled the tribal lands under strange, desperate circumstances, one who had worked for the white men. The new character had a surprising connection to Sarah's past. The matriarch realized that the stone meant Sarah's grandmother, or perhaps her own mother, had passed through these very lands. Their fates, it seemed, had been subtly intertwined long before the first whisper of their meeting. Soaring Eagle's hardened expression softened barely, replaced by a calculating intensity. She was bound by ancient custom to consider the needs of the clan and the sanctity of their refuge. A mixed-blood fugitive and a disgraced warrior would draw unwanted attention. The spring provided water, but acceptance would demand a price. The matriarch rose, her gaze sweeping from the frail boy to the resolute warrior. Her words were quiet, but carried the weight of the canyon walls. The clan offered no easy sanctuary. The price for protection, for the water and the temporary safety of the hills, was not silver or gratitude. It was a test of worth, an assessment of their spirit and their willingness to integrate and contribute. She stated with chilling clarity that the passage or the information they needed was not free. She would offer them the shelter of the Dragoon Hills, but only for a fixed period of time. After that, they must prove their loyalty to the people or face the wilderness once more. The trial began immediately. The sanctuary Soaring Eagle offered was not a place of rest, but a crucible of ceaseless activity designed to test their mettle. For Whispering Wind, the work was a familiar, brutal routine: repairing stockades, mending saddles, and tracking game with the younger hunters. His disgrace momentarily set aside for the common need. For Sarah, the challenges were more profound. She had to transition from a frightened fugitive to an essential element of the small, tightly knit community, constantly observed by the wary, silent women of the clan. She worked in the camp, kneading dough, mending hides, and grinding corn under the unrelenting sun. Her movements were slow at first, born of exhaustion, but her determination grew with every successful task. The other women, initially guarded, began to observe a quiet strength in her, a fierce protectiveness toward Thomas, and a singular focus on her duties. She did not complain. She simply endured, her back straight and her eyes always forward, earning small, grudging nods of respect. Her greatest test came when she discovered that one of the clan's crucial water caches had been raided by a hungry pack of coyotes. Fearful of drawing attention with gunfire, the community was faced with the immediate, complex problem of silently tracking and eliminating the pack without losing valuable man-hours that were desperately needed for gathering wood. Whispering Wind watched as Sarah knelt by the scattered tracks. She did not possess the warrior's tracking knowledge, but a deep, almost forgotten skill emerged from her Yaqui heritage. She applied an unexpected skill that became the key to solving a complex problem. She did not follow the tracks forward. Instead, she studied the pattern of the animal's retreat, noticing the precise way the coyotes avoided certain sharp rock outcroppings and the minute shift in the direction of the wind currents, revealing where they were taking refuge. She explained her theory to Whispering Wind, detailing how the pack, burdened by their recent meal, would choose the path of least resistance, not the most hidden trail. Her intuitive reading of the landscape and the animal behavior, a knowledge long dormant since childhood, provided the unexpected solution. They were able to intercept the pack quickly and silently, securing the remaining cache. This success, born from a subtle, intuitive knowledge of the wild, elevated her status. She was no longer just the mixed-blood fugitive. She was a woman who could read the land in a unique, valuable way. Her confidence grew, built upon these small, hard-won victories. She began to learn how to load and clean the old rifle. Whispering Wind kept hidden, her hands, once soft from domestic servitude, becoming calloused and steady. However, her progress and the fragile acceptance she had gained were brutally interrupted. The clan was gathered in the valley, celebrating a successful hunt, when a figure rode into their camp, a man on a blood bay horse, wearing the clothes of a trail scout, feigning exhaustion and goodwill. His name was Jonas Thorn. He spoke of being lost, looking for a misplaced prospector's claim. Whispering Wind's eyes narrowed. The man's story was too smooth. His clothes too clean for a true desert wanderer. Thorn was a mercenary, sent by Donald Harrison, and his presence was a direct threat. Thorn, spotting Sarah, offered a too-easy, unsettling smile, suggesting she might know the area better than the others. He challenged her new position, his tone heavy with condescension and doubt, placing in doubt everything she had achieved so far. He remarked that a beautiful woman should not be found with savages, but safely under the protection of a rich, generous man. The implication was clear. She was still property, and her newfound freedom was a dangerous delusion. Sarah stood her ground, the shadow of the rifle in Whispering Wind's hand a silent testament to her defense. Thorn's smooth facade was a thinly veiled trap, and his challenge was a stark reminder that their peace was temporary, and their enemy was already among them. The presence of Jonas Thorn, the mercenary, was a poison in the fragile peace of the Dragoon Hills. He was offered the forced hospitality of the camp, but Whispering Wind never took his eyes from him. The tension intensified over the next few days. A silent struggle of wills played out in the harsh sunlight. Thorn, feigning camaraderie, tried to gather intelligence, watching the patrol routes and the location of the tribe's meager resources, but his focus remained fixed on Sarah and the boy. He was Harrison's dog, sniffing out the lost property. The crisis struck not as a direct attack, but as a silent, creeping disaster. An early autumn downpour, relentless and sudden, swelled the canyon riverbeds into raging torrents. The floods were unprecedented, and the main path leading to the high-ground grazing lands was utterly washed out. Several key members of the clan, including Soaring Eagle's young niece, were trapped on the far side of the roaring water with the most vital supply of winter forage. The traditional methods of crossing were impossible. The current was a liquid sledgehammer. Panic began to ripple through the camp. It was in this moment of pure crisis that Sarah stepped forward. The clan's hunters, men born of the mountains, saw only the impossible surge of brown water. Sarah saw the debris, the way the water flowed around the largest boulders, and a specific, ancient sycamore tree precariously leaning over the narrowest gorge. She remembered the stories of her Yaqui grandmother, tales of building temporary crossings over flash floods using natural leverage and speed. The traditional methods had failed, and she alone assumed control. She directed the men not to build a bridge, but to use ropes, strategically attached to the sycamore, swinging heavy, anchored bags of wet sand and rock with precision. The goal was to quickly construct a temporary pendulum-like rope path, taking advantage of the brief moments of slack between the current's peaks. Whispering Wind recognized the daring and the sheer brilliance of the improvised method. He rallied the others, using his strength and authority to execute Sarah's plan. She was not a warrior, but she was a commander in this crisis, her voice clear and absolute over the roar of the flood. In the middle of the frantic effort, as Sarah was securing a vital anchor point near the sycamore's root, her hand brushed against something buried in the exposed, wet earth. It was a crude, small wooden cross, unlike the finely carved symbols of the Catholic missions. Etched onto the wood, almost invisible beneath the moss, was a faded symbol, the identical serpent and dagger symbol worn on the buckle of Jonas Thorne's belt. She discovered a shocking truth about the origin of the crisis. Thorne had not been lost. He had been here before. This spot was not just a gorge. It was a rendezvous point, a place for him or his kind to mark and observe. The flood was natural, but Thorne's presence here was deeply premeditated, confirming that their pursuers knew the hidden geography of the hills intimately. The crossing was a brutal success. The men and the supplies were saved, and the fear in the camp was replaced by a resounding relief and deep gratitude directed at Sarah. But the climax of the moment was Thorne's reaction. He had watched the entire scene. His lips curled in a confident smirk that faded into utter shock as he realized what Sarah had done. He saw her courage, her unique knowledge, and the growing, undeniable connection she shared with the Apache warrior. When he realized she was staring directly at the sycamore root, his composure shattered. He bolted, seizing his horse and riding out of the camp in a desperate, reckless gallop that confirmed his true purpose. He hadn't been defeated by force, but by a sudden, brutal exposure. Whispering Wind and Sarah had saved the clan, but in the process, they had driven away Harrison's spy, making the inevitable return of the true threat a certainty. The rival who challenged them became the catalyst for the next, greater challenge. They knew the relative safety of the hills was now a ticking clock. The departure of Jonas Thorne, though sudden and reckless, left a false, deceptive peace in its wake. The immediate danger had receded, replaced by the grim certainty of a greater threat to come. In the interim, the days settled into a quiet rhythm of recovery and connection. Sarah's heroism during the flood had earned her more than just respect. It had earned her a place. She was no longer observed with suspicion, but with a deep-seated acceptance, forged in the crucible of shared survival. This period was characterized by scenes of domestic tranquility. The sun, now warmer and kinder, shone on small moments of partnership. Sarah and Whispering Wind spent hours together, not speaking of the past or the imminent future, but simply working. They repaired the flood damage, weaving new reeds into the shelter roofs and meticulously inspecting their stores. They shared meals around a small sheltered fire, the scent of burning juniper and roasting venison a comforting constant. The quiet was their language. The profound bond grew around young Thomas. The boy, recovering from his fever, began to flourish under the dual tutelage of the adults. Whispering Wind taught him the silent lessons of the desert, how to identify the safest trails, how to draw water from seemingly dry riverbeds, and how to track the small, elusive creatures of the canyon. Sarah, watching the warrior interact with her son, the silent patience, the gentle authority, saw the raw grief in the Apache finally begin to give way to purpose. The routine became a tender, desperate imitation of a family, built on shared defense and the silent language of mutual need. One evening, by the fire, Sarah shared the fragments of her childhood, the distant memory of her Yaqui mother, the forced labor she endured under Harrison, and the constant gnawing fear for Thomas. Whispering Wind, in turn, allowed a sliver of his own tragedy to escape the stone prison of his heart. He spoke of the sharp, crippling emptiness left by his son's small hand, the way the silence in his empty lodge had driven him to seek death. The vulnerability was raw, a confession spoken not in words, but in the shared, quiet acceptance of suffering. The connection was built on shared experience and mutual trust. The revelation that solidified their bond arrived through a small, seemingly insignificant object. While mending one of Whispering Wind's old, worn leather satchels, Sarah found a dried, brittle drawing folded deep within a hidden pocket. It was a child's crude rendition of a horse and a stick figure. When she asked Whispering Wind about it, he explained that his own son had drawn it, a final, fragile memento. Sarah's eyes widened, recognizing the distinct, awkward scribble. She confessed that her son, Thomas, had been given a similar unfinished drawing by the wife of a kindly ranch hand who had worked for Harrison years ago, an older woman who had briefly offered her protection. The drawing, she realized, was made on the same distinctive cream-colored ledger paper used by Harrison's accountants. Whispering Wind looked closely at the crude figures. The man who had briefly sheltered Sarah was an old friend of his, a fellow outcast who had once tried to mediate peace between the settlers and the tribes, only to be branded a traitor. He had taken care of Whispering Wind's wife and son during the last fever outbreak. Before his death, the friend had left Thomas with a partial drawing, a small gift from the Apache boy who had perished. Their destinies were already deeply intertwined. Their paths, they realized, had not just intersected at the abandoned cabin. They had been running parallel for years, their lives shadowed by the same fever, the same war, and the same desperate desire for refuge. The profound sense of predestination brought a brief, fierce comfort, but it was abruptly shattered. The wind shifted, carrying an unnatural smell, not juniper or dust, but smoke and the sharp, acrid scent of gunpowder. Soaring Eagle rushed into their quiet space, her face grim, her voice low and tight. Runners had intercepted a scouting party of well-armed men, not mercenaries, but Donald Harrison himself, leading a large, disciplined force. They were not searching, they were advancing, confident in the information Thorne had given them. The peace was broken by the arrival of an imminent and undeniable external threat. The sanctuary was about to become a battlefield. The news of Donald Harrison's approach swept through the Dragoon Hills like a wildfire, consuming the short-lived peace. This was not a discreet mercenary seeking a treasure chest. This was a calculated, overwhelming assault designed to reclaim what Harrison considered his property and to eliminate those who dared to defy him. Whispering Wind knew that the clan, though skilled in stealth and defense, could not withstand a frontal attack from such a large, heavily armed force. The sanctuary had become a snare. The warrior moved with a focused, almost frightening determination. He was no longer the defeated man who sought an end. He was a fierce protector. His new family, the small, desperate unit forged in the fire of shared peril, was the only thing that mattered. He worked with Soaring Eagle to mobilize the defenses, urging the clan to evacuate the elders and children to the highest, most concealed passes. Sarah, no longer a victim or a stranger, stood by his side, an essential part of the defense. Her hands, once accustomed to the softness of cloth, now gripped the stock of the old rifle with practiced steadiness. She organized the supplies, her knowledge of the white man's tactics gleaned from years of servitude, giving them a critical edge in predicting Harrison's movements. She was a defender, strategically positioning herself not just for her son, but for the community that had given them fleeting safety. Her eyes held the protective fear of a mother and the steely resolve of a seasoned fighter. The force of opposition, Harrison and his men, struck at dusk. using the shifting canyon shadows as cover. The smell of gun oil and horse sweat mixed with the desert dust. Their initial attack focused on the hidden spring, the most vital resource. A skirmish erupted, swift, brutal, and loud, a stark contrast to the eternal silence of the canyon. Whispering Wind and the Apache warriors met the assault with disciplined defense, relying on their knowledge of the terrain. During the exchange of gunfire, Sarah noticed a detail that chilled her to the bone. Harrison's men were moving with an unnerving confidence, bypassing complex natural barriers that should have slowed them. They were being guided. Whispering Wind's strategy relied on the maze-like quality of the hills, but this was being nullified. The principal threat was not acting alone, but with unexpected help. Sarah realized that Thorne's escape had not been a failure but a tactical retreat. He had left behind markers, the same crude wooden crosses she had seen at the Sycamore, small, almost invisible signs pointing directly to the clan's key defensive positions and supply caches. This was a betrayal deeper than simple reconnaissance. The Apache had been betrayed by their own land, their defenses mapped and given away. They were being outmaneuvered not by superior numbers, but by superior intelligence. As the fighting intensified, and a section of the defensive perimeter began to buckle under the relentless pressure, Harrison himself shouted an ultimatum across the canyon, his voice booming with arrogant certainty. He demanded the return of his property, the woman and the boy, and the location of his stolen treasure. He swore that if the Apache refused, he would burn the entire hillside, leaving nothing but scorched earth and ashes. Whispering Wind looked at the terrified faces of the few remaining women and children. He looked at Thomas, clutching Sarah's hand, the small boy's eyes wide with a fear that mirrored the warrior's own devastating past. He could not, would not, allow this new, fragile family to be destroyed. Making a split-second, impossible choice, he lowered his rifle. He had to gain time, to save the sanctuary that had given them life. He stepped out from the cover of the rocks, raising his hands high to show they were empty. He was trading his liberty, and potentially his life, for the safety of the clan. He called out in a clear, resonant voice, acknowledging Harrison's demand. He was offering himself in exchange for the safety and immediate withdrawal of the entire raiding party. The chapter ended with the warrior making a choice of ultimate sacrifice. He was placing himself in mortal danger to save his new family, relinquishing the very freedom he had fought so hard to protect. The canyon fell into a sudden, tense silence, broken only by the distant, ragged breathing of the men and the slow, heavy hoofbeats of Harrison's approach. Whispering Wind stood exposed, his hands open, the very picture of surrender. Donald Harrison rode forward, a man whose avarice had given him the illusion of righteous power, his face hard with triumph. He dismissed the Apache's offer with a cruel laugh. He had the warrior, and he knew he held the ultimate advantage. He demanded Sarah and the location of the treasure, threatening to execute Whispering Wind immediately if his demands were not met. But Sarah was no longer the frightened fugitive from Dust Creek. Seeing Whispering Wind standing alone, offering his life for hers and her sons, cemented a resolve stronger than fear. She stepped out from the shadows of the rocks, Thomas clinging to her skirt, her face resolute. She had the one thing Harrison truly feared, the truth. She spoke not of the treasure or the boy, but of the hidden wooden markers and the true origin of the stolen wealth. Her voice, clear and steady, accused Harrison not of theft, but of a decade of blood-drenched land speculation and the systematic murder of those who stood in his way, actions she had meticulously witnessed and recorded during her servitude. The antagonist used brute force, but the protagonist used knowledge and moral superiority. The dramatic tension was palpable. Harrison, momentarily stunned by her defiance and the cold, hard facts she presented, roared at his men to seize her. But before they could move, the final scene of the battle began, coming from an entirely unexpected source. The young Apache warriors, whom Whispering Wind had spent the last weeks training, emerged silently from the higher rock formations. They were not armed with rifles, but with the knowledge of the canyon's treacherous currents. They had diverted the main flow of the swollen river, not to flood the valley, but to channel it into a deep, hidden fissure. A fissure that Harrison's men, guided by Thorne's shallow markers, had been instructed to avoid. As Harrison's closest men advanced, the ground beneath them, already saturated by the earlier rains, gave way. The earth did not collapse. It became a slick, impossible bog, trapping the horses and throwing the riders into the mire. They were not defeated by gunfire, but by the canyon itself, weaponized by the skill of the Apache youth. In the ensuing chaos, Whispering Wind moved. He did not seek to kill Harrison, but to neutralize him definitively. He used the cover of the confusion, employing the silent, disarming techniques he had learned in his scouting days. He confronted Harrison, not with a knife, but with a swift, decisive movement that disarmed the mogul and left him stunned, his costly weapon thrown into the rising mud. Harrison was defeated, not by death, but by complete public humiliation and the loss of his men and his power. The true victory, however, came from the unlikeliest of allies. Soaring Eagle, observing the victory from the high ground, signaled her people. They had captured Jonas Thorne, who, in his haste to escape, had fallen into an auxiliary trap set by the elders. Sarah, now holding the undisputed moral high ground, did not demand revenge. Instead, she presented Harrison with a chilling choice. She possessed documented proof of his land fraud and murders, proof that she had meticulously copied and hidden far outside the canyon. She would trade this evidence for one thing: his eternal, absolute exile from the entire territory, and a sworn promise that he would never again pursue her, Thomas, or the Apache clan. The confrontation ended with a strategic, surprising act of wisdom over bloodshed. Harrison, faced with ruin and incarceration, accepted. The main threat was vanquished, but the fight had cost them dearly. As Harrison and his remaining men were guided away, stripped of their power and their mounts, Sarah looked at the smoldering remains of their cabin on the ridge. A small pocket of fire still glowed fiercely, consuming the last vestige of their brief, fragile sanctuary. A minor element of the conflict, the physical destruction of their home, escaped resolution. A new question hung in the dry desert air. Where would they go now that their home was dust? The ashes of the cabin had long since cooled, becoming part of the canyon dust. Months had passed since the showdown with Donald Harrison, bringing with them a profound, lasting peace. The Dragoon Hills, once a reluctant sanctuary, had become a true home, not built of adobe and mortar, but of shared history and mutual protection. Whispering Wind and Sarah settled into a life defined by quiet contentment and the legacy of their struggle. The transition was not simply about survival, it was about building. The clan, now unified under the wise leadership of Soaring Eagle and the strategic knowledge brought by Whispering Wind and Sarah, had begun to prosper. A scene of domestic tranquility now illustrated the new normal. They rebuilt the damaged stockades, not as walls of fear, but as boundaries of security. Whispering Wind, once the outcast, became a revered elder and mentor to the young warriors, his knowledge of the settlers' world now used for defense, not for servitude. Sarah was the heart of this new existence. She worked the small community garden near the hidden spring, her hands moving with the certainty of a woman whose place was finally undeniable. Thomas, no longer pale and feverish, ran through the canyon trails, his laughter echoing against the silent rock faces. He learned the Apache language from the children and the subtle art of tracking from Whispering Wind, growing up as a child of both worlds, his mixed blood heritage a badge of unity, not division. One bright morning, while excavating a new foundation for a communal structure, the clan unearthed an artifact. It was a stone tablet, weathered and nearly forgotten, deep beneath the earth near the ancient burial grounds. Soaring Eagle cleaned the surface, revealing a set of ancient petroglyphs, a history of the canyon. The carving spoke of the first settlers of that land, a group of mixed-blood people, part indigenous, part Spanish, who had sought refuge in the canyon centuries ago, making a blood pact with the local tribes to protect their shared home. The final revelation of the journey was the discovery of an ancient connection to the place. The tablet showed a distinct symbol, a small, stylized bird of prey nested above a protective hand, a symbol Sarah immediately recognized. It was the mark her own Yaqui mother had secretly embroidered into her baby blanket, a mark she had always assumed was a simple decoration. The petroglyphs confirmed that Sarah's ancestry was not just an accident of the frontier, but a lineage deeply tied to the canyon's very first people, those who chose unity over division. Her presence in the Dragoon Hills was not an invasion. It was a return, a fulfilling of an ancient promise. Her act of saving the community was pre-written in the stones of the earth. Whispering Wind watched her trace the symbol, a look of profound peace settling on his face. The peace he had sought in isolation, the death he had courted, had been replaced by a life he had earned through sacrifice. The journey had taught him that the greatest courage is found not in the willingness to die, but in the fierce, unrelenting decision to live and to protect. His grief was still a part of him, but it was now a foundation, not a tomb. He had given up the physical treasure for the desert, but the desert had given him a new family, a home, and a legacy. The home is not a place, but the feeling of belonging, a fortress forged in the fire of adversity. This, then, is the enduring truth of the frontier. The true value of any man or woman is not measured by the gold they hoard, but by the love they are willing to defend. The home is not a structure of wood and stone, but a feeling of absolute security, a fortress forged in the fire of shared adversity, where courage is found in the smallest, most protective actions. Whispering Wind had come to the canyon to die in peace, but he found redemption, a future, and a love stronger than any sorrow, all within the eyes of a woman and her child. Did you enjoy this journey into the Old West? Tell us in the comments what part of the world you are watching this story from. Leave your thoughts, and so you don't miss the next adventures, subscribe to the channel.